I'm going to start reading just a few scriptures because to understand what happened, we have to start with the scripture. The Bible, in Revelation chapter 6, it says, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed." Okay, so these are the martyrs who testified. Can you say testified?
Testified.
Unto death. And it says that their souls are under the altar before the throne of God. And they're crying out for the day of justice. They're crying out for the day when everything is made right. You know that day is coming. You know that Jesus is coming to the earth and his kingdom will be established on the earth. Amen. Amen. And we pray it every day. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. Where? On earth, as it is in heaven. Heaven will come to earth. The kingdoms of this world, the rebellion of this world, will come to an end. Amen. And the Bible tells us that that day of justice, that day of the Lord's return, what does it depend upon? It actually, in this scripture, says it depends on those who testify unto death. Is that right? They testify unto death. And it says there's a certain number of martyrs who will testify in that way. And then that day will come. Turn to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, we read about a war in heaven. Verse 7. It says, "War broke out in heaven." This is one of my favorite scriptures. Can we read it together? "War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them, the accuser of our brethren has been thrown out, the one who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives to the death." Can we say it together? They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They loved not their lives to the death. One more time. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives to the death. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Okay, both of these scriptures are talking about the transformation of the earth. They're talking about the day when the devil and all his angels are cast down. And that victory, that great victory, is not the victory of Jesus over the devil. That's not what it says. What does it say? Does it say Jesus overcame? What does it say? They overcame. Can you say they? They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives unto death. Why not Jesus overcame? Why doesn't it say Jesus overcame?
It's inferred in the blood, because he already did.
He has already overcome. When he rose from the dead, he rose victorious over death, hell, and the grave. It says he rose up through the heavens and is seated at the right hand of the Father. Amen. You understand? Jesus has overcome. And yet at the same time, although he has overcome, although he is victorious, what does Paul say? He says, hey, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against the spiritual host of wickedness in the heavenly places. Is that right? He's saying, even though Jesus has overcome, we wrestle against principalities and powers, against spiritual armies of wickedness. Can you say spiritual armies of wickedness? In the heavenly places. The rulers of the darkness of this age. Those things were written after Jesus rose from the dead. What does that mean? Yes, he rose. Yes, he is victorious. But even though he defeated the devil, and even though he defeated the angels, he allowed them to remain on the earth until what? Until we overcome. He allowed them to remain, even though they are defeated. He allowed them to remain until the saints overcome. Are you with me? Okay. Until the saints overcome. And how do they overcome? By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and not loving their lives to the death. There is a testimony unto death that changes nations. There's a testimony unto death that brings breakthrough in the heavenly places. When you study history and you look at those who testified unto death. Okay, if you want to look at the Bible, you can look at Moses. Go and speak to Pharaoh, let my people go. And in fear for his life, knowing that Pharaoh's probably going to kill him, what does Moses do? He goes with Aaron to Pharaoh, let my people go. Now what happens? The power of Egypt is broken. When you study the history, you see a complete collapse of the authority of Egypt at that time. And the children of God go free. Moses overcame by the blood of the Lamb on the doorposts, by the word of his testimony, and he loved not his life to the death. So all through history, you read about these overcomers. When we talk of missions, and you read about the mission movements, you read about the Moravians, they had a 100-year prayer meeting. And in that prayer meeting, as they laid their lives on that altar, they hear a story of an island where nobody's allowed to preach. And because it's owned by a slave owner who has slaves on that island, nobody's allowed to preach there. And two young men, they say the only way we can reach those slaves is to become slaves. And they sold themselves as slaves. And they said goodbye to their parents. They got on a boat, and they sold themselves as slaves so that they could go and preach the gospel to that island in the Caribbean. And again, as you read the stories of missionaries, you read about those who testified unto death. You read that again and again and again. And when you read those stories, it usually seems very foolish. Okay, you read the story of David Livingstone. He goes to the students in Cambridge, in England, and he says, hey guys, I've just been in Africa. Africa's being controlled by Arab slave traders. He says, but I'm going back. I'm going back to Africa. Follow me. Come, bring Christianity and commerce and civilization to Africa. And he's speaking this to upper middle class college students. Actually, he's speaking this to the elites of society. Okay, Cambridge being the best. It'd be like the school students of Harvard and Yale. Hey guys, come. Leave everything. Come to Africa. Amen. The slave traders are controlling Africa. Come to Africa. Preach the gospel. Bring the gospel. And thousands of upper class students left everything and went to Africa. Some of them would buy a coffin. They put their belongings in the coffin, put the coffin on the boat, and go to Africa because they knew they were only going to live 6 months. They said, send my body back to be buried in the coffin. They died like flies. In the early days, it was estimated that the lifespan of a missionary was only 6 months. And there were thousands that walked out that example. Why did they die so fast? Well, the malaria, the disease, the things that they weren't immune to. And they went to Africa, and they didn't see millions of Africans become Christians. They saw a handful, a very small number. Used to be estimated that one missionary died for each African convert. But that's a testimony unto death. Do you think that testimony changed Africa? Reinhard Bonnke has led millions and millions of Africans to the Lord. One day he was looking at the great crowds that were coming and the millions who were turning to Jesus. And he said, Lord, such a great harvest. And the Lord spoke to him and said, Bonnke, this is not your harvest. This is the harvest from the tears of those who came before you. One sows, another reaps.
Amen.
Africa did change. The power of the slave traders was broken. The multitudes turned to the Lord. Can you say amen?
Amen.
If you're from Africa, raise your hand and say amen. Why does Africa change? It changes because of a testimony unto death. Spiritual victories are won that way. That's how they're won, biblically. That's how they're won in history. That's what changes nations. I think you're getting the point. We have a PowerPoint.
Yep.
So tonight we're here to talk about Allen Chau. And of course, Chau was an overcomer who overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of his testimony, and he loved not his life to death. And he walks in the footsteps of many who went before him. He walks in the footsteps of many others. We're talking of Africa. When you study Africa, there was some research done a few years ago, and a guy by the name of Woodbury, he began to study the parts of Africa that received missionaries and those that didn't. And the question was, why do some nations develop stable representative democracies where they have a right to vote, they have the right of free speech, they have the right to assemble freely, and neighboring countries are just dictatorships where if you even speak anything, you're in danger? And he studied this in Africa, he studied it in Asia, he studied it all over the world. Why are countries so different? Why is there one country and right next door there's another country that's an absolute mess? And there's another country that's a democracy, and there's a lot of blessing, and people turning to the Lord, and a lot of blessing on that country. And he began to study the missionaries that those countries received 150 years ago. Which countries received Bible-believing missionaries? And this was his claim. Areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today. Better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental organizations. And so a whole list of blessings came upon the countries that received these witnesses. Okay? In other words, the spiritual battle is won when you testify unto death. And even in the natural, even in the area of education, even in the area of development, even in the area of economy, there's a blessing today upon the nations where someone testified unto death. You can see it in the natural, you can see it in the spiritual. It's amazing research. In fact, the best way to tell is a country blessed today, he discovered, was what kind of missionaries did they receive 150 years ago.
Amen. Wow.
And those that received Bible-believing evangelical missionaries were tremendously blessed today. It's a study you guys should read. Those that received Bible-believing evangelical missionaries received the whole list of blessings. Spiritual blessings, natural blessings, in every way. And the lie, of course, is that these missionaries were just used by colonialism to spread the empire of Europe. And it's not true. In fact, many times the missionaries sided with the Africans against the colonialists. You had the colonial power trying to suffocate different tribes, and the missionaries standing with those tribes and saying, no, you can't do this. In other words, most of what we hear is actually lies. The missionaries who gave their life and testified of Jesus Christ released incredible natural and spiritual blessings. And you can even find it in the research today. Amen. What's the point of all this? Well, we're talking of an overcomer. We're talking of John Allen Chau, who testified unto death, who gave his life to reach an unreached tribe. And, of course, people say, this is foolishness. Okay, the one thing that people say is, hey, he really loved God, he really loved people, but boy, was he foolish. It was so foolish to pour out your life. And it's the same testimony that was said to these university students 150 years ago. You're upper class, you have a future, you have an education, and you're going to pour out your life to go to some tribe in the middle of Africa, and you're going to die within 6 months. You idiot. And yet they did it by the thousands, and Africa changed. Is that foolishness or is that wisdom? I believe it's wisdom. John Chau had a singular focus from high school days. He felt such a strong call of God to North Sentinel Island that he spent 8 years of his life preparing for it. He prepared naturally, he prepared spiritually. People say he was going to bring disease to those islands. He studied disease. He studied tropical medicine. He studied sports medicine. He took all the possible vaccinations. He made plans if anything went wrong, how they could fix it. He studied that stuff inside and out. He quarantined himself. He did everything he could do to make sure that he didn't bring disease there. He trained spiritually. He went to a ministry called All Nations and asked them to train him in mission work. And they trained him how to minister in a foreign country, how to have an observant heart, not to bring your own culture into a tribal culture, but to respect the culture that's there and to see God transform that culture and redeem that culture, not to kill that culture. He studied language training courses. Nobody knows which language the Sentinelese actually speak, okay? But he studied the nearby languages that were close so that he could know a few words, so that he could hopefully communicate just a little bit. So he's prepared himself naturally and spiritually, and he focused his life on, like a laser. I'm going to go testify in North Sentinel Island. And if it cost me my life, it cost me my life. And so he arrived in the Andaman Islands. That's a chain of islands between India and Thailand. He arrived there October 16th. And then on November 14th, at night, he took a boat to North Sentinel Island. And as the sun came up, he came near the tribe. And men armed with bows and women came making noises. And he begins to try to communicate with them. My name is John, and I love you, and Jesus loves you. He begins to testify however he could to try to make them understand a little bit. And that was the first day. He went on this boat, didn't really go to land, just testified from the boat and went back. The next day, he goes back again. And this time, he began to sing worship songs, he began to speak to them. And he said, I heard the whoops and shouts from the hunt. I made sure to stay out of arrow range, but unfortunately that meant I was out of good hearing range. So I got a little closer, and they began to yell at me. And I tried to speak the words they were speaking back to them, and they began to laugh at me. And he goes on and tells a story. And finally, one man who had a white crown on came up to him. And again, he tries to communicate. Sorry, my computer's giving me issues here. He tries to communicate with him. And they begin yelling at him. And as they're trying to communicate, and he's singing songs, he's trying to speak the word of the Lord to them. a little boy comes up, not a boy, a young man comes up and shoots him with a bow, and he's holding his Bible. He's actually in a kayak, and shoots him with a bow, and it hits the Bible. And they take his kayak, and he flees. He goes back to the boat. And he goes, so they have a boat, and he had a kayak where he's going to shore to preach the gospel. And then he writes, he writes that the arrow just pierces the Bible, but it doesn't actually hit him, doesn't actually wound him very badly. And then you read his journal entries. You read the journal entries that night. He's been shot with an arrow, and he knows he's not finished yet. What's he do? Does he go home and say, I tried? What should I do? I went, I did everything I could to communicate. I don't think I communicated very well with them. I don't think I spoke very much, they understood. But I tried, I did everything. And they shot me with an arrow. And he writes in his journal, I'm scared. There, I said it. I'm frustrated, uncertain. Is it worth me going on feet to meet them? Should I get out of my boat and go? And he says the language gap just seems too tough to get over. Yet, Lord, you will be close. If you want me to actually get shot or killed with an arrow, then so be it. I think I could be more useful alive, though. But to you, God, I give all the glory of whatever happens. I don't want to die. Would it be wiser to leave and let someone else continue? No, I don't think so. I'm stuck here anyway without a passport and have been off the grid. I still could make it back to the U.S. Somehow, it almost seems like certain death to stay here. Yet there's evident change in just 2 encounters in a single day. I already see them opening up a little bit. I'll try again tomorrow. And then he writes this. You guys might think I'm crazy in all this, but I think it's worth it to declare Jesus to these people. Please do not be angry at them or at God if I get killed. Rather, please live your lives in obedience to what he has called you to, and I'll see you again when you pass through the veil. Don't retrieve my body. This is not a pointless thing. The eternal lives of this tribe is at hand, and I can't wait to see them around the throne of God, worshiping in their own language, as Revelation 7, 9 to 10 states. I love you all, and I pray none of you love anything in this world more than Jesus Christ. I love you all, and I pray that none of you love anything in this world more than Jesus Christ. And the next day he went back for the 3rd time, and they dropped him off. And the fishermen who dropped him off, later on they saw the tribe dragging his body through the sand. That story touches and impresses me, that after you've been shot with an arrow, and you're judging all things, you say it's worth it. It's worth it to go and testify one last time. And the world looks at that and says, that's foolishness. It says you threw your life away. And heaven looks at it and said, there's one who proved that he loved Jesus more than his life. I love you all and pray none of you love anything in this world more than Jesus Christ. Okay, we live in a society where we have something called celebrities. Have you ever heard of a celebrity? And we celebrate shallow people. We celebrate celebrities. We celebrate those who live for pleasure, those who live promiscuous lives, that whatever they desire to do, whatever desire comes in their hearts, they live for themselves, they exalt the flesh, they do whatever it is they want to do. And we say these people are worthy to be celebrated. Everything they do is so important. We all need to know about it. We need to follow it online. We need to follow it in our magazines. We need to follow it on the television because it's important. And this guy, who loves Jesus more than his own life, he is a fool. Okay? That's the society we live in. In the 1950s, you had a missionary called Jim Elliot. And of course, Jim Elliot went to a South American tribe to preach the gospel, and he and his friends were killed. And when they were killed, they put him on the cover of Life magazine, and the whole nation mourns, the whole nation honors him. And there was a move of missions that came because people honored what he had done. And today our country despises it and mocks it. The Christians say it wasn't done properly, and the world says, they talk of Darwin Awards, they mock it in the cruelest terms imaginable. But what does heaven say? I believe heaven says, this guy finished his race. He finished his race. There's not very many who finish the race. There's not very many who finish the race. If you follow Jesus, there is much blessing. Is that true?
Amen.
There is much blessing. He has many good things for you. But if you run that race to the end and don't get off track, it does cost you everything. Do you believe that? If you look at the apostles, if you look at the disciples, were they blessed? Very, very blessed. They changed the world. But in the end, after they testified, they proved that they loved Jesus more than their own life. And they gave their life. They all became martyrs. They finished their race. They testified, and then they proved, I believe this testimony with everything in me. And they became martyrs. And those are the ones that cause nations to change.
Amen.
Those are the ones that are celebrated in heaven. Are there celebrities in heaven? Yeah, there are. When Stephen testified, his face was shining, and he preaches the gospel to a mob that wants to kill him. Face shining. And he says, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father. Jesus himself gets up to celebrate Stephen. Jesus himself gets off his throne to celebrate Stephen's testimony as he finished the race. The Apostle Paul had a race. He was an apostle, called to change the world, called to the Gentiles. Where was the capital of the Gentile world? It was in Rome. Paul didn't want to go to Rome. He loved the Jews. He wanted to go to Jerusalem. And he kept saying, I feel I have to go to Jerusalem. And finally he goes to Jerusalem, and when he gets to Jerusalem, he doesn't succeed. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of confusion. And finally he gets thrown in prison without one person in Jerusalem turning to the Lord. Without one miracle. And 2 years in prison. And they ask Paul again, Paul, come to Jerusalem to be put on trial. What does he say? He says, I appeal to Caesar. Let me go to Rome. My race, given to me by God, ends in Rome. My race, given to me by God, is not my choosing. It's not what I want to do. It's what God has given me to do. And I need to go to the capital of the world. I need to go to the capital of the Roman Empire. I need to go to Rome itself. I need to testify before principalities and powers, before rulers. He had to testify before the emperor himself. Then I've finished my race. And so when Paul writes this, in Timothy, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He's saying, hey, my final testimony is here. I'm going to speak the word of God to the rulers of the world. I'm going to testify of Jesus Christ. And as I do, I'm going to seal my testimony with my own blood, and I'm going to go home. My race is over. And of course, as he does that, the power of Rome is shaken, and the gospel is spreading through the whole Roman Empire. In Philippians, Paul speaks to the Philippian church, and he says, I'm confident of this. He who began a good work in you is going to complete it. Why? I hold you in my heart. We are connected, and my chains are causing you to become bold. He's talking of a supernatural connection between himself and the church, that as he testifies unto death, as he testifies in chains, boldness comes upon the church. Amen. That's why we celebrate Allen Chau. Why? It's part of the same body. And we say, Lord, let there be connection, that as he testified unto death, let us receive something from that.
Come on.
Because it's one body.
Amen.
Can you say one body?
One body.
One body.
One body.
And it is worthwhile to celebrate the one who finishes the race. Who do you cheer for? The guy that runs the first half of the race well, and then quits the race, says, let me retire and have a good life? Or the one who runs it to the end? In the Christian church today, what do? We expect the new converts to testify. The high school students, go talk about Jesus in your school. But us pastors will sit behind our desk. You know what I'm talking about? And we live comfortable lives. We live comfortable lives without risk. Comfortable lives without risk. And we expect the spiritual babies to take the risks. What do you read in the New Testament? You read about a leadership who testified unto death. A leadership who never got intimidated. And they finished the races. They finished the race.
Come on.
And they changed the whole world. Because as they testified, the power of Rome was shaken. The power of religion was shaken. The devil and his angels are cast down because of those who overcome by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they love not their lives unto death. What's my point? There are very few people alive that actually finish that race. Very, very few. It is highly unusual. Highly unusual. Highly unusual. And those that do, they change the world. If you follow Jesus, there is much blessing. But if you would completely obey him and fully walk out that race, it'll cost you everything. Maybe you don't become a martyr, but you'll have the heart of a martyr. And you will take risks. You understand? I have a friend who the Lord called him to one of the hardest parts of the world, where to even mention Christ can get you killed. And his father testified unto death and was killed. And then the Lord said, go to that same tribe, go to that same place, and walk in your father's footsteps. And so he went, knowing that he might die. And he almost died. He was put in prison. It's an amazing story. But he walked in his father's footsteps, and he testified to a tribe of extremist Muslims that are known for their violence. And he testified, and the main leader turned to Jesus Christ and became a believer. But not just that leader. That leader reached the entire tribe. The entire tribe turned to Jesus. My friends were just there last week to see it. The story was so amazing you couldn't believe it. My friends went and said, hey, it's all true. The whole tribe is turning. And I watched my friend who started this whole progression. And I watched him wrestling with that call. Why? Well, he has amazing stories. If he can come to America, he could start a ministry in America going around the churches and telling about the wonderful stuff that's happening in that part of the world. And the stories are so amazing, he'll get a job, okay? And I watch him wrestling with that. Knowing, if I run the race, my father was killed. My younger brother was killed. My other brother is testifying in the most dangerous part of the world. A place where soldiers fear to go. And when I met him, he was running from the call. Just it was difficult. He said, my brother just died. I have to get out of there. And the Lord ministered to him and healed his heart, and he went back. Okay. There's a race. Things haven't changed. You understand that? Our society's changed a little bit. Where we honor foolish and selfish people, and we despise wise people. But heaven honors those who finish the race. And the Bible speaks of a reward. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard what the Lord has in store for those who love him. Okay, Jesus, his favorite topic was about reward. He talks of those who are great in heaven and those who are least in heaven. Okay, we think everybody's the same in heaven. Is everybody the same in heaven? No. No, 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 no. There are great rewards. And those are those who enter heaven like one jumping through fire. There is an aristocracy in heaven. There are those that are highly honored for eternity. And there are those who are least. And if you want to study the teachings of Jesus, he taught this again and again and again and again. He talked about reward. If you love those who love you, what reward will you receive? Don't even the tax collectors love those who love them. In other words, the number one thing that determines a great reward in heaven, that you have that supernatural love of God, that you would give your life even for your enemies. It's a big topic. I could teach on for days. But it's all through the New Testament. We are saved by faith. Okay, you understand that. But after you are saved, there is still a great reward that comes according to what you've done. You with me? I can teach it. It's all through the New Testament. You're not saved by works. You're saved by grace through faith. But after you're saved, there are those who lived their life in such a way that there is great reward. There is treasure stored up in heaven for them, and there is great reward waiting for them. I believe that Allen Chau lived his life with great wisdom. I believe he focused on the call that God gave him. He didn't waver from it. And on the night that he shot with an arrow, he says, "Let me go back." And I believe that in heaven he is celebrated. I believe that for eternity he is honored. I believe that when we meet him one day in heaven, we're going to say, there's a guy that lived his life with great wisdom. And he did what he was called to do. And I believe that even in this lifetime, the impact that comes from his testimony is the impact that changes nations. I believe that you'll see a transformation of that part of the world. You'll see open doors. When there's open heavens and there's victory in the heavens, what happens? Well, Stephen saw open heavens. Stephen said, I see the heavens open and I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Lord. When the heavens are open, people see Jesus.
Amen.
He saw Jesus. He had an evil Pharisee riding his horse under open heavens. What happened? He saw the Lord. And after Stephen said the heavens are open, there comes this explosion of the gospel into the whole world. It says those that fled the testimony of Stephen went everywhere preaching not only to Greeks but also to Gentiles. He had this amazing breakthrough in the Gentile world. That's what the Lord told me. He said, if you raise up missionaries that testify unto death, and they testify without fear, you start to get victory in the heavens. And he said Muslims will begin to turn to you and say, we saw Jesus. We had a vision. We saw him. Why? The heavens are being opened. When the heavens are opened, people see Jesus. You start to have divine encounters with God. That's the testimony, guys. I'd like to take something from that. I know enough of I don't presume that I've walked out much of my calling. I don't presume that I've gone very far. I don't think I have. But I want to. You understand? I want to. I want to walk it out. Say, Lord, change my heart. Give me that love where you would give your life for the sake of the gospel. You give your life for those he sends you to. And you do it because of love. Can you say because of love?
Because of love.
The Bible says, hey, even if you give your body to be burned, but do not have love, it will profit you nothing. But to give yourself because of love is a great reward. A great, great, great reward.
Amen.
A great, great, great reward. It will be profitable for you to win that race, to finish that race. Say, Lord, I've got these years left. I don't want to spend it just in a safe, secure environment. I want to do what you have me to do. And I know for me, that's a whole series of steps where the cost can be high. And those steps that he gives you that you have to struggle with. Can I really do that? Can I really take that step? You know, what if this happens? What if that happens? What about this? What about that? And you see John doing that on the day before he takes his final step. And yet I believe that's the walk of faith. And I believe that's the walk of love. And I believe if you walk it and speak his word, I believe you begin to have impact on this earth. And I believe that one day God will say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your rest. Amen.